Hi, everyone, and welcome to Thursdays at the Museum. I'm Amanda Harrison, Community Engagement Manager at the Detroit Institute of Arts, and I'm so excited to have you join us for this brand new talk exploring masterful Dutch paintings in the DIA's collection. We want to encourage you to join the conversation by leaving a public comment on this Facebook post or by logging into YouTube using your Gmail account. Questions will be read on screen by Christine Mark, the DIA's Manager of Volunteer Development. To start us off, please welcome our hosts, Ray Henney and Cindy Patrick. Hi, guys.
Hi, Amanda. Thanks so much. Hello, Cindy.
Hi, Ray. Hi, Amanda.
Cindy and I are very excited to do this tour today. The DIA possesses one of the largest and finest collections of 17th century Dutch paintings outside the Netherlands. The collection includes famous paintings by such masters as Rembrandt and Ruysdael. Indeed, several rooms on the third floor of the DIA comprise a separate dedicated gallery to 17th century Dutch art. Well, why the 17th century? For the Dutch, which is now known as the Netherlands, the 17th century was its golden age. The Dutch had freed themselves of Spanish rule and enjoyed both political and religious independence. The Dutch were able to embrace fully the Protestant Reformation with its teachings of personal worship of God, admiration of God's creations such as nature, and rejection of the excesses of the Catholic Church. In fact, the then dominant Calvinist Church set rigorous standards for modesty in Dutch culture. This painting in the DIA's collection is of an abbey that the Spanish troops destroyed during the Dutch struggle for independence and commemorates the Dutch victory. Next slide, please, Kimmy. Further, in the 17th century, the Dutch enjoyed one of the most powerful economies in the Western world due to vast shipping and commerce. They also formed new colonies in different and distant lands. The Dutch, for the Dutch, this robust economy created a large and thriving merchant and middle class who had expendable income and appreciation for luxury items such as art, particularly paintings. Now, traditionally, painters typically created pieces that were commissioned by the church or nobility or the extremely wealthy. And those who commissioned the painting selected the subject matter of the work. Next slide, please. Thank you. But the merchant and upper middle classes' demand for art created an art market in which painters created works to be sold to the public. Dutch artists were prolific, creating an estimated 300,000 paintings. The combination of artistic principles and public demand caused the dominant style during this period to be realism, often with minute detail, while the dominant subject matters included images of nature, patriotism, material wealth, morality, and spirituality. We think you'll find these works highly appealing and interesting just on their face, but many of them are filled with cultural and religious symbolism that enhances the depth of their meaning. Cindy and I are going to present these works by their genre. So we're first going to cover paintings dealing with commerce, economic wealth, and patriotism, then religion and devotion, to morality, of course, the master Rembrandt. Then we'll go to portraits, landscapes, and finally still lifes. Cindy, kindly start us off with paintings concerning commerce, economic wealth, and patriotism.
Thanks, Ray. So our first image today is coastal scene with a man of war and other vessels. You can see it was done in 1692. So this was at the end of the 17th century. This is toward the end of the Dutch Golden Age. And as Ray said, the Dutch had already freed themselves from Spanish rule, but they continued to be threatened in their trade routes by France and other countries. So this coastal scene was commissioned to be like a historical document of this event, and also as a source of national pride. So in 1692, we had the Battle of La Hogue, and it was the Dutch trade routes, as I said, were being threatened by France. And Kimmy, if you'll go to the next slide, please. So we had the North Sea, which was where the trade routes came in and out of the Netherlands. And then if you see that other larger body of water, kind of in the center of the landmass, that's called the Zuiderzee. And the trade route that they were coming through, Kimmy, if you can go up to that very first little island that you see come down, right there. That's called the island of Texel. And so if you'll go back to the other slide, that was the actual waterway that this battle took place in. So this ship is flying the Dutch flag. And often when people happen to walk by, the Dutch galleries and see this, they confuse it for the French flag because both of them are red, white, and blue. But the Dutch flag, the red is at the top and the stripes run horizontally. In the French flag, the blue is to the left and they run vertically. But it's easy to be confused by that. So this was one of two ships that were built in 1690. One was called the Schirmer and the other one was called the Beschütter. Both of those words translated mean protectors. We're not sure which of the two this was, but we assume that it was the Schirmer because it was the larger of the two. It was 130 feet long and it had 44 guns. It was heavily armed. So if they knew that they were going into a threatening type situation, they probably would have used the larger of the two. So as it traveled through that main channel from the North Sea into the Zuiderzee, it was able to actually win this battle with the French and continue to protect the trade routes. So the map that we looked at was from the 1650s. And if we can go back to that for just a moment, what I think is interesting about it is when we looked at that Zuiderzee, if you see those lighter gray areas that are inside of the islands, those are they were areas that were hoped to be reclaimed by dikes and being able to dam up water because, in the Netherlands, they were always trying to reclaim land to be able to have more to build upon. So when you look at some of the maps that are more current, you won't see those drawn exactly the same way because those land masses change. Okay, one more time back and then we'll finish up. So in the foreground of the painting, you can see kind of in the center foreground, we have local fisher folk and they're peddling their day's catch. And they're contrasted with the people on the left who are very elegantly attired. They're walking their beautiful greyhound along this beach. In the background, we have, in the distance, we have very low-lying land, which, of course, what is most of the Netherlands is low-lying land. And then we see the other warships sailing away from the viewer. So this is painted on canvas. As we go through today, some of the works of art that we're going to look at will be painted on oak panel, which was common in Dutch art. But some of the larger paintings are on canvas. So as we go through, Ray and I will try to point out to you which is which. One last thing I want to mention is that in protecting these Dutch East India trade routes, the types of things that they were protecting and the types of routes they were protecting, they went all the way, as Ray said, from the colonies that were established in North and South America. They went across to Europe through the Mediterranean. They went around the Horn of Africa up to the Indian Ocean and all the way up through the Pacific Rim. The trade consisted of things like tortoiseshell from the Caribbean, oranges from Spain, ivory from Africa, beautiful Persian rugs from the Middle East, pearls from the Persian Gulf and from the Indian Ocean, and of course, beautiful blue and white porcelain from China. So all of these trade goods had to be protected. It was, a very, very well-established trade route. The last thing I want to mention about this painting is about the provenance of it, and I probably won't talk too much about this with any of the others, but I thought this one, it was kind of important. This was actually a repatriated work of art. It was returned to the heirs of a man by the name of A. Cohen, and through the Art Loss Register, which I thought was kind of interesting, and later sold to the DIA. We took ownership of it in 2002. Our next work of art is called the Sinfonia, And oh, we've just got so much to talk about with this one. So this is actually painted on canvas. And for a long time, I thought it was painted on an oak panel because up in the top third of the painting, there's a line that goes across it that I always thought was a crack in the oak panel. But when I did our research for this talk, I found that it's painted on a linen canvas, and that was actually a place where the canvas had been folded. So if you go into the galleries and you notice that, you'll know why it's there. This happens to be another pretty large painting, which is unusual for the Dutch galleries. Most of the paintings are quite small because people had very small homes, because of the lack of land. But this one is pretty big, and everything in it is pretty big. So with the Sinfonia, we've got this couple, man and wife, and they're given equal attention. You can see that she's dressed in white satin. She has a beautiful blue shawl wrapped around her shoulders. She's got on exquisite jewelry, pearls, cabochons, rubies. And the gentleman, equally well dressed. He's got on a velvet cloak, white linen blouson shirt underneath. He's got beautiful tooled silver buttons that go down the front of it. In front of him, he has an instrument that's called a viola da gamba, which is just a bass violin. And behind them, you can see even their servant is extremely well dressed. She even has a string of pearls on around her neck. She's holding a tray of oranges, which, as we said, were a trade good that came from Spain. Expensive, hard to come by. So you would have had to have been from the upper class to be able to have these and enjoy them. And then the title of the work comes from the piece of music that is folded open on the tabletop. It actually is called a Sinfonia. And on the corner of the page, there's a number 12, which tells us that it was number 12 in the set of, I think they were called cantaras, which meant dances. If you are a person who reads music well, you can even tell what the meter of the music is. It's amazing, all the information that's on that sheet of music. So let's talk a little bit about the symbolism behind this. I mean, it's pretty much in your face. This is all about material wealth, all about having it all. And if you look at the date, 1671, we're kind of at the end of the first 2/3 of the Dutch Golden Age. So the idea of the Calvinism, morality, and their ideals that you should live a life that is quiet and that you shouldn't put too much stake into material goods. This is kind of starting to fade away. These people are really—
This is not a modest family, is
it? They're enjoying it.
No. I mean, I don't know about you, but we not only do we not have servants, we don't have servants who dress like that.
Or who wear pearls, right?
No.
Even the floor of this residence that they live in is beautiful black and white marble. And if you look, off in the distance behind the pulled back curtain, you can see that, this is an Italianate kind of architecture. I think the statue that is there is of Athena. So these folks are really living the good life. They're part of this oligarchy ruling class, that have built their wealth through Dutch trade. The center of all trade throughout the world went through the Netherlands. To get to anywhere else, it had to go through the Netherlands. And the Dutch East India Company took their little percentage off of everything that went through. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to you, Ray.
Any questions, Christine, before we go on?
Not at this time. Thank you.
Great. Next slide, please, Kimmy. Oh, we have some of the detail. Yeah. So
I go back to the detail.
Yeah, I know it. I knew that was going to happen.
We did have a little conversation about this when we were doing our prep the other day.
Yes.
And one of the symbols that you'll frequently see in Dutch genre paintings or, day in the life type paintings is there will be a glass or a goblet that is half full. The symbolism behind this is that you should do everything in moderation. But hey, look at this goblet glass. It's not anything to do with moderation. It's got this beautiful tooled silver base. And then it looks like it might have been hand blown, and it actually has some sections that are kind of pulled in, and then it is bulbous and then pulled in and bulbous. And so as we were prepping for this, Christine mentioned that they often would blow a glass goblet in this way because while they were eating, they often used their hands, and their hands would be slippery with grease, so it was easier for them to hang on to. And a secondary reason for these sections on the goblet was if they were doing communal drinking, they would know by each section how much they were allowed to drink. I thought that was a super interesting tidbit. Kimmy, thank you for putting that little zoom blow up there.
Okay, Kimmy, here we go. So now we're turning to paintings concerning religion and devotion. Here are two paintings which are currently on display at the DIA. Actually, they're hung next to each other. The interior of churches and cathedrals were a popular subject matter for paintings purchased by the wealthy and the upper middle class. And there was really two reasons for that. First, it demonstrated the owner's devotion to Reformed Christianity. And second, these paintings were beautiful due to their dazzling realism and the sensation of perspective. Cindy, when you stand in front of these paintings, I mean, on the slide, it's hard to appreciate. You really feel like it's 3D, like your arm could go inside the painting. They have such a don't they have such a feeling of space?
And the light effects are gorgeous.
Gorgeous. Let's talk about that in a moment. So next slide, Kimmy. Let's start exploring these. So this is the interior of the Grote Kerk in Haarlem. It's done by Job Burkheid from 1676. It's about 4.5 feet tall and almost 4 feet wide, and it is oil on canvas. Although a very versatile artist, Burkheid is best known for his painting of architectural views. This painting of the DIA is one of his most imposing depictions of a church interior. It's the southeast view of the Grote Kerk, or Great Church, in Haarlem, where the artist lived for most of his life. It's dedicated to Saint Bavo, an important saint in Haarlem history. The church is referred to as St. Bavo's and among the largest of Dutch churches at the time. Notice the clear, white, and bright interior. Unlike Catholic cathedrals, Protestant churches did not display large paintings and gilded appointments in dark, dramatic light. Instead, the church is simple in comparison, with white walls and a bright interior. This reflects Protestant beliefs in modesty and the rejection of excesses. Indeed, when the Dutch changed Catholic cathedrals to Protestant churches, such as we'll see in the next painting, which is a church that was a Catholic cathedral, they removed the paintings and most of the ornaments. The walls were painted simply, and the illumination of the sunlight was absolutely maximized. So Burkheid gives force to this painting by using a massive architectural elements of the church, specifically the foreground piers and arches, to focus the viewer's attention into that deep space. The artist uses the repetitional patterns of the arches in that single point perspective system, with the vanishing point not being in the center of the painting, but just to the right of the painting. And it effectively doesn't draw you like this, it draws you like this. And it makes the painting that much more interesting and technically challenging. It is considered to be an extremely accurate rendition of the church's interior. But Burkheid enlarged the scale of the church to exaggerate that feeling of depth and that pronounced perspective that you get. So you see the two human figures in the background there. They are actually smaller, represented as being smaller than they would be in the actual church. But overall, Burkheim's effort here is to enhance the compositional impact to inspire devotional feelings. Let's go to the next slide, please. This is the interior of the Oude Kerk in Amsterdam, done by Emmanuel Duet in 1686. It's the same size, practically the same size as the other painting. It's about 4.5 feet tall, over 4 feet wide, again, oil on canvas. He was an extremely popular and influential painter of his day, and he's considered to be the greatest of all architectural Dutch painters. In fact, Burkheid was greatly influenced by De Witt. This is a view of the south aisle across the west nave of the Oude Kerk, or Old Church, in Amsterdam. Like the painting of St. Bavo's, as we just discussed, this painting seeks to inspire through dramatic spatial renderings of the church's interior. The view across the nave creates this enormous sense of, contrast and scale through recession. Duet, as Burkheide, enhanced the drama perspective by enlarging the size of the columns to give them sort of a massive, heavy appearance. In the actual church, the columns are thinner and taller, more elongated. DeWitt further heightens perspective with accents of color, as Cindy was talking about, and the strong patterns of light and shadow that also accent that feeling of depth, gives it perception. However, DeWitt also depicts human piety in this particular painting, as on the right side, the community gathers together to show devotion. You have the patrons sitting intently listening to the words of the preacher in the pulpit at the far side of the nave. DeWitt emphasizes this aspect of the painting by the diagonal shafts of light that start at the bottom left and move to the right. This provides depth and leads the eye toward the preacher, and it highlights the importance of his words of devotion. Questions yet, Christine?
That's right. There is a comment, first of all, that the cathedral arches are really nice. They are, in fact, beautiful. And then also, you mentioned the streaming light in through the clear glass windows. And it's so interesting that the Dutch Calvinist belief system removed all that stained glass when they were Catholic cathedrals, and then replaced it with the clear glass to let that light of God shine in as they perceived it to be.
Exactly, and this is one of those cathedrals that was turned into a Protestant church, and it's an excellent example of how they took down the ornaments and they brightened. They took down the stained glass. Virtually all those windows were stained glass windows at the time, which made this dark and dramatic. For the Dutch, the light was God's inspiration, but it was also God's blessing on them. So it was an important symbolism for their spiritual life.
Absolutely. And that's why throughout this talk, we're going to see how Dutch paintings used light to symbolize the presence of God.
Absolutely. Very important symbol. All
Absolutely.
right, Cindy. We're going to go from spirituality to
Morality.
Morality.
Morality. Yeah, Ray, we're going to be taking a look at a couple of genre paintings that were really sort of cautionary tales about morality and how to behave. And before we get started on this one, I thought I'd ask you, Ray, what do you notice?
Well, first of all, I don't know what the deal is with the servants in the Dutch, but this fella is really dressed to the nines there with that outfit that he's got going. And she is the woman, obviously, who is the center of attention of these servants, has a wonderful garment. I mean, it's beautifully painted. You also have that rug on the table, which is kind of interesting, and other objects like the candles and so forth. So there's a lot of interesting, different kinds of things. And of course, another dog.
Always
always dogs in Dutch painting.
So thanks, Ray. So we're taking a look at Lady at Her Toilette. You can see this is circa 1660. It was done by Gerard ter Borch, and he was a contemporary of Johann Vermeer. And this particular painting is considered to be not only one of the best paintings in the morality tale genre of paintings, but also one of his best. So the DIA is really fortunate to have it in our collection. So the Lady at Her Toilette, she's dressed in this beautiful satin gown, and he was known as the painter of satin. No one could do it better than he could, and he did it a lot. He painted a lot of paintings of women in satin gowns. So you can see the bottom of her gown is white, and that was symbolic for purity. Her bodice of her dress is blue, which was symbolic for jealousy. And then she kind of has an open-shouldered inner bodice. And this dress, probably either she's getting dressed or getting undressed, because all of her dress is not there. She wouldn't have gone out in public with that much of her neck and shoulders showing. If you can see behind her, there's a servant who's kind of pulling on the strings of that corset that she has on. And then if it isn't enough, this beautiful white satin and blue bodice, it's all trimmed in probably 24 karat gold thread, down the front and along the hem of the dress. And as you said, the male page is exquisitely dressed. And Terborch has done other paintings with pages in them, and they have similar dress. They wear those red kind of puffs, right under their knees. So it was sort of their uniform attire. And then take a look at the fireplace that's in the background. It has what we call ionic columns on them. And from the research that we came up with, this is not an actual this was not an actual interior that he painted. It was a composite of sketches that he had made of different things. So that fireplace was known to have been in a public building in the Netherlands. And so he's just kind of inserted it here. And it shows up again, as you'll see in the next companion piece that we take a look at. But let's get back to the symbols. We have the extinguished candles in the candlestick. So they can mean two different things. It can mean that it's actually daytime. We don't need the candles lit. But extinguished or snuffed candles also, to the Dutch public, they would have known this symbol to stand for the transience of earthly existence. So, you better behave while you're on this earth because your life is short. Another symbol of an extinguished candle would have been of love's passing caused by a lover's absence. And if you'll look in the very center of the painting where she sort of has her hands coming together, she's actually turning a ring on her finger. And so we have to wonder, is she putting that ring on, taking it off? The look on her face is sort of off kilter, like she might be a little bit disturbed by something. So, maybe she's upset by her lover's absence. Maybe she's thinking about, no longer being in the relationship that she's in. But then we have that cute little dog over on the right-hand side, and he's always a symbol for fidelity. So it's kind of at odds with, her moving this ring around on her finger. Also in this painting, it's a little bit hard to see in the slide, but the page is standing in front of a mirror that has a gold frame around it. And in that mirror, we see her reflection. So that symbolizes the temporary nature, again, of her existence, and that, beauty doesn't last forever. It's also a hint at maybe cooling passion that she might have in this relationship. It can be a symbol of her vanity. The expensive objects that we see on top of that table, that silver candelabra, that gold frame, definitely point to the affluence and comfort, not only comfort, but excess, that is in the life of this woman. I do want to talk a little bit about that rug. Ray, you brought it up, and thank you for doing that. So rugs in Dutch paintings are often called lotto's, and they're called that after the famous painter, Renaissance painter Lorenzo Lotto, who included the first textile of this sort in an altarpiece. So these were rugs that were brought from the Middle East. They often were in tones of red and yellow. And these ornamental Lotto rugs, they were very expensive. Again, a trade good. So they were never set on the floor. They either hung on a wall as a tapestry, or in a lot of Dutch paintings, you'll see them covering a table. But this idea of a Lotto type rug and the pattern of this rug also is used to help sometimes date paintings that came from this Dutch era, because they pretty much point to the 17th century. So they depicted them on tables in domestic scenes, portraits, sometimes in still lifes, but they were always a sign of wealth and good taste. Christine, do we have any questions about Lady at her toilette?
We do not, Cindy.
Okay, if we can move on to the next one. I wanted to show you the companion piece. This is called Curiosity, also done by Terborch. And what's interesting here is what I want to show you is it's almost exactly the same satin skirt. It's almost as if he used a template to, and just reversed it to paint it. And it is exactly the same model and exactly the same fireplace. And we know that this woman was his sister. Her name was Jacina. and he used both of his sisters very frequently as models. But you can see that's exactly the same visage, the same face. Thanks. Okay, we can move on.
Ah, Cindy, it was the weekend at the Patrick's house.
I know. So we went from that beautiful, elegant, quiet interior scene to, you know, mayhem, total mayhem. So Ray, I'm wondering, what do you notice in the immediate foreground of this painting? Let's not
Well,
even.
you've got this fella who is obviously he looks drunk, and this woman who's trying to hold him back. And interestingly, in this painting, you have the men misbehaving, and the women, some of them with light on them, trying to restrain the men. That's what you see in the foreground. And then, of course, you've got all these broken objects. You got a broom and different different items that are scattered around the floor.
So the title of this is Gamblers Quarreling. So it is mayhem, and it was painted by Jan Steen, and he actually was a tavern keeper as well as a painter. So he knew firsthand what could happen inside of a tavern. And the two women are the only two that are in any form of restraint in this painting. We do have a group of fellows on the right, three of them, one of them smoking a pipe. It looks like they're egging on the fight. They're not actually in it. And then up at the top center, we can see there's a fellow who's fiddling some music while it's going on. So I think he's enjoying the show as well. Somewhere in this painting, which I'm not able to see in the slide, there's a chalkboard, and they actually kept track of how much the people drank so that they could, I guess, collect from him at the end of the evening. So they would mark, up on the chalkboard, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Anyway, on this chalkboard, wherever it's at, there are a whole bunch of strokes. So, I mean, there was a lot of drinking going on. In the foreground, you see the broom. That's a symbol for, obviously, uncleanliness. The game that they were playing, we know it as backgammon today, but they called it trick track. We can see some cards that are strewn about in the foreground, a tankard that's been dumped over. And then in the other corner on the right, we see it looks like it might be a ceramic vessel that would hold beer. Well, in this area of the Netherlands, I think this is Haarlem, the water was so pure and so fresh and good that breweries abounded everywhere because they had access to this pure water. So drinking was, constant. And here we have this Calvinist ideal of everything in moderation. And yet the middle class folks are just whooping it up all over the place. We even have one of the fellas in the foreground getting ready to pull a dagger out of his waistband. They've all had too much to drink. And at the very top, you can see there's like a wooden chandelier with some kind of greenery kind of growing in it. And there's actually an inscription on it, and it comes from the Proverbs, chapter 20, verse 1. And it says, "Wine is a mocker, strong drink is raging, and whosoever is deceived thereby is not wise." So it's a perfect commentary for all of this mayhem that's taking place. So why did they continually paint these cautionary tales? Most of the folks that lived in that part of the world during the Dutch Golden Age were literate. We had a lot of wealth. People, young people were sent to school. People had good educations. But we still did have the lower class. And those folks still needed visual imagery to teach them, morality and how to behave properly. So these types of paintings were very, very popular. Do we have any questions about this painting, Christine?
No, we actually don't have any questions.
Okay, so in lieu of the time that we have ahead of us, I'm going to turn it back over to Ray.
Thanks, Christine. And thank you, Cindy. So, Cindy, Rembrandt, perhaps the most famous and influential of all Dutch painters. During his lifetime, Rembrandt enjoyed popularity and international fame. He headed his own productive workshop with many apprentices, students, and assistants. We are going to talk about these two paintings, which are currently on display at the DIA. In fact, there's a room dedicated to Rembrandt in the Dutch Gallery. Next slide, please. This is the Visitation, done in 1640. It's very small. It's only just over 22 inches tall and not even 19 inches wide. It is oil on cedar panel. This is one of the DIA's treasures. It is because it's one of the very few paintings in North America that Rembrandt painted entirely himself. You can notice, and particularly if you go to the museum, that on the first step, Rembrandt placed his signature, which is interesting because he does not always that obviously place his signatures on his paintings. This painting is of the story of the gospel of a story in the Gospel of Luke in the New Testament of the Christian Bible. This is the only known painting that Rembrandt did of this story. So the story goes that after Mary is told by an angel that she is pregnant with Jesus, she learns her much older cousin Elizabeth, who is beyond childbearing years, also miraculously is pregnant. Mary and her husband Joseph travel to see Elizabeth and Elizabeth's husband Zacharias to rejoice in both their pregnancies. When they meet, Elizabeth's womb stirs, indicating to her that Mary is carrying the Christian Savior. This meeting between Mary, who is pregnant with Jesus, and her older cousin Elizabeth, who is pregnant with who will be John the Baptist, is the first encounter of the women's miraculous children, although yet unborn, and at the time considered by many viewers to be a transformational moment for all of humanity and certainly Christianity. Rembrandt enhances the drama of this moment by setting Mary and Elizabeth in a large stage-like doorstep that seems to sweep out of the house and centers the narrative around the two cousins by bathing them in a seemingly supernatural glow of light that's Cindy from a mysterious source. It just comes from above. He further highlights the importance of Mary in Christianity with the color of her clothing and her clothing. It's beautiful with deep blues and reds with touches of gold. And then you have animals and plants, which are symbols or understood as symbols at the time. Could you go to the next slide, Kimmy? Yeah, we have some details here. So a dog, again, another dog. And as Cindy just said, the Dutch and other cultures included dogs as a traditional symbol for loyalty and or fidelity. And when you go to the Dutch galleries, you'll see many, many dogs in the paintings because it was a very popular symbol. To the right is the peacock that is on the lower left of the painting. Peacocks bear both ancient and Christian symbolism. First, peacocks were the sacred bird of Juno from ancient mythology, who is the protectress of married women, particularly those who are pregnant. And second, for Christians, the peacock symbolizes immortality and Jesus' resurrection. Behind the peacock is a rose bush, and rose bush are a traditional symbol for Mary, but the thorns also symbolize the crucifixion. Now in the center is a little bit of a detail of the background of the painting, which is the city of Jerusalem. And Rembrandt painted it as he believed it would have looked at the time the story took place. This was unusual at the time because the artistic convention was to place biblical stories in contemporary settings. They did this to avoid aging the biblical stories and to keep them fresh and relevant to the viewers. Now, this painting had a deep, intimate meaning for Rembrandt. The face of Elizabeth is based upon the artist's mother, who died earlier that year. And Rembrandt also recently had lost 2 children to infancy. So he's extremely sensitive about pregnancy and childbirth. And in fact, at the time he painted this, his wife was pregnant with child. Unfortunately, after he completed the painting, she too would lose that baby 2 weeks after birth. Next slide, please. This is called Christ, and Rembrandt painted this over a 2-year period of 1648 to 50. This also is not very large. It's 23 inches tall and just over 21 inches wide, and this is oil on oak panel, as Cindy was mentioning. Now, scholars believe that Rembrandt likely painted this portrait of Jesus entirely himself, but they don't have the confidence or certainty they did with the Visitation. That's why you see it's attributed to Rembrandt. This is a very different looking rendition of Jesus for the time period. Could you go to the next slide, please? Thanks, Kimmy. Here's a painting of Jesus done by the famous artist Guido Reni, and this is in the DIA's collection. René's version is the typical European depiction of Jesus. He looks like an idolized ancient Greek or Roman sculpture with European features. Painting Jesus in this way was popular because it was relatable to then contemporary viewers. In other words, it fit the desire that Jesus would be an idolized version of Europeans and not a person from Middle Eastern descent. Next slide, please. Rembrandt's version is much different. Jesus was born a Jew, so Rembrandt bases his painting on the likeness of Jews with whom he was familiar. At the time he created the painting, he lived in the Jewish quarter of Amsterdam and had contact with the community's spiritual leaders. Scholars speculate that the image is based upon a young rabbi Rembrandt knew. Yeah. So just as Rembrandt went against convention in the last painting to paint Jerusalem as an ancient city and not a contemporary city, Rembrandt attempts here to accurately show and actually paint Jesus as he might have looked. Notice the brushwork. It's energetic and it's very skillfully executed in his face and hair in the folds of the garment. The figure has broad, low forehead, high, wide cheeks, and tapered face. He has silky, heavy hair and is parted in the middle. He has a thin mustache and a beard that hardly covers his chin. The face, symbolistically, emerges from a deep ambient shadow into a strong light. But it's not a noble or majestic or heroic face, but one showing sensitivity, compassion, and a sense of humanity. Any questions, Christine?
There was a question in general. You talked about Rembrandt having a school in which he taught other painters, and did he often have other people work on his pieces, or did he do more of them himself?
He had several. There are several paintings at the DIA that are from Rembrandt's workshop that were originally attributed to Rembrandt. So he was very popular. He mismanaged his money, but he was extremely popular. He sold and had a lot of commissions until late in his life. And so many of his apprentices and assistants would paint a lot of the painting, or all the painting, but a lot of the painting under his direction, and he might finish it at the end. There are some examples of that. In fact, there's a portrait of Rembrandt that was thought to have been a self-portrait at the time when it was purchased by the DIA, but was later determined it was done by one of his apprentices.
Okay, thank you, Ray.
Sure. Cindy, portrait paintings?
Well, we're moving on to a very different kind of portrait from the one that we were just looking at that was so spiritual and he was dressed so plainly. This couldn't be in more contrast to what we just looked at. This is Portrait of a Lady, done by Nicolas Piccanoy. And among the docents at the DIA, all you have to say is the Piccanoy, and everyone knows the painting that you're talking about. It's actually life-size. It's 48 inches tall and 36 inches wide. And it
must have cost a fortune to commission this.
You know, the commissions were they actually decided what a commission would cost by the length of it. If it was a bust, that was lesser in price. If it was a half size, then the price went up. If it was 3/4 length, it was more expensive. And this one actually is like 7/8 length. So this one would have been way up there. You can tell by the way she's dressed that she definitely came from the oligarchy or the patrician class. We think that this was probably one of 2 portraits that were marital portraits. We usually call them pendant portraits. The other one's been lost, in time. No one knows what happened to it. No one knows the identity of either one of these sitters. But let's take a look at what she's wearing. In the Calvinist ideal, you were supposed to dress in a subdued manner. Well, I guess you could say dressing in black was subdued. It was also the fashion of the time that had been kind of established by Eleonora of Toledo in Italy, and then it transitioned over to Spain, and then the Dutch started to copy it. So streetwear was usually in a subdued, gray or black. The beautiful colors that lady at her toilette wore would have been worn only inside the home, not out on the street, out in public. So she has on this beautiful millstone ruff. She has on a bonnet that is so translucent. The way that he painted this is just unbelievable. You almost feel like you could stick your hand right through it. But he even included a shadow of it on her ruff. She has beautiful complexion, which would have been unusual at the time because people suffered from so many maladies and smallpox and you name it. So to have a perfect complexion was very unusual. Then she's got these beautiful lace tatted cuffs. And if you look in her, would be her right hand, which is on our left, she's holding a pair of what we believe to be wedding gloves. They were made out of really fine leather. And again, they have all of this beautiful lace work around the cuffs or the edges. She's wearing 2 gold bracelets and a gold ring. And then let's talk about the center of her dress, which is called a stomacher. And if we can go to the next, we've got details of it. So right underneath that ruff in the center of the dress, all of this has been embroidered in 24 karat gold thread. So there's really nothing about this dress that's subdued, really. So we've got a crown right underneath her ruff. And then the rest of the stomacher has motifs of tulips and other flowers in it. Okay, Kim, if you would go back again, please. So let's talk a little bit about Piccanoy. He was from Amsterdam, and believe it or not, he lived right next door to Rembrandt studio. The name of the street was called St. Anthony's Brierstad. I hope I said that correctly. So they did know each other. And up until Rembrandt surfaced, Piccanoy was the leading portrait painter of Amsterdam, but he was definitely dethroned by Rembrandt. Rembrandt took over. So his commission works, for the most part, would have been were from these wealthy families who dominated, the civic arena and the economy of the Netherlands. They controlled the economic, political, and civic affairs. They intermarried to retain their wealth and power. And the regent or patrician class had the determining influence even on major military operations. So, we were talking about the man of war and the Battle of La Hogue. They had a lot of influence over making sure that their economic interests were protected. The Dutch admiralties were created to defend their commercial interests and their fleets, and of course their trade to the Baltic states, the Mediterranean, and the Far East. So this woman definitely would have been part of that very upper class. It was really a small group of the population who controlled most of the wealth. Let's see, I don't think there's anything else I wanted to tell you about this, except that this is painted. It's very large. It's 48 by 36. It's painted on an oak panel, which is unusual for such a large painting. And the surface of it, as we see in many Dutch works of art, looks like glass. The hand of the painter doesn't show. And that was a technique that they really worked hard to attain. All of this, embroidery and this linen, this beautiful tatting on her gloves. I mean, it's a lot of detail, but it looks like glass. You can't, it looks like a photograph, a super real photograph. And that was what the artist was trying to attain. And he was very successful at doing that.
It was very popular at the time.
Very popular at the time. Christine, do we have any questions about the Piccanoy before we move on to the next portrait?
How about the black background?
The black background doesn't really give us any sense of space or time. It's kind of an eternal sort of a background. You know, we can date it by what she's wearing, but the background isn't important. She's important. All of the attention should be focused on her.
Okay, and there was a comment that I would like to note, and you talked a lot about the Dutch East India Trade Company and the trade that created such a wealthy class in the Dutch Republic. One of the things that both of you mentioned along the way was colonization, and one of the viewers has mentioned that we haven't talked about enslavement and the fact that some of this wealth building was also done through enslavement and the trade of humans. And yes, that is in fact true.
That is true.
So, you know, there was
Portuguese-
coffee, tea, and chocolate. There was colonization. There was, you know, silk and porcelain. But also, unfortunately, the Dutch and the Spanish and the Portuguese also traded in enslaved humans.
That was a major component of trade, not only as a trade good, but also to make all of the trade happen. You know, I mean, if you were taking tortoiseshell from the Caribbean, you know, enslaved people were probably the ones who were procuring that tortoiseshell. So not only were they being used as a trade good, but they also helped create much of these trade goods. So it's great that someone
just to note, and many of the colonies thrived and created wealth because of enslavement. So thank you to our viewer pointed that out.
There are historians who argue that most of the Western economy was built on that trade and that labor.
Well, it certainly was a huge influence on, you know, in the 16, 17, and even 1800s. We see that over and over again. So thank you for that contribution.
Should we go to the next, Cindy?
Sure. This is portrait of a woman as opposed to portrait of a lady. And this is done by Frans Hals, who was also a very well-known Dutch painter during his lifetime. You can see this was painted in 1634. So it was, you know, around the time of the other. What's interesting with this one is we kind of had that same gray background. She's got on a similar type of a bonnet. She's got on that same type of millstone ruff. But this is very unusual in terms of, if you were to look at Frans Hals' lifetime of work, this type of painting seems at odds, because he painted much like Ray was describing with Rembrandt. He painted with spontaneous brush strokes. The hand of the painter usually was very evident in his painting. But guess what? He had to make a living. So when he took on these commissions, he painted in this much more restrained manner, because that's what the sitters wanted. We know that this painting is part of a pendant or a set. And the husband of this woman is actually it's in a museum in San Diego. And the way that they know that they belong together is that in the 1800s, a watercolorist painted copies of the two of these together. So at that time, they were shown together, and we know that they were together. We don't know the identity of the two people. We don't have names for them. In contrast to the Piccanoy painting, which had all of that detail all over the dress, Frans Hals' woman has on a jacket that's very plain, you know, no detail other than the sewing of the seams where it holds it together. Another thing that was mentioned in some of the research that I looked at was that she's sitting in a very awkward pose. If you look at her right arm, which would be on our left, it seems like it's kind of kicked out in an odd way that would almost be impossible to sit that way. And her hands are clasped together very strongly, no jewelry. So you can see this painting of this woman. This is someone who's not trying to show her wealth. She's trying to live by, the Calvinist ideal. So she's been painted in, a much more subdued manner. I want to talk, and we're at, this would have been a cheaper painting because it's only half size. But I want to talk a little bit more about Frans Hals. So throughout his career, I think he was married twice. He fathered 10 children, but he came from a family of painters. 2 of his brothers were painters. 5 of his sons were painters. He taught one of his son-in-laws to paint. So there was a lot of talent in that family. Like a lot of artists, even though he had a lot of commissions and he made a lot of money, he wasn't good with his money. He was always struggling financially. And really toward the end of his life, like the last 3 or 4 years, the burgermeisters of the area where he lived gave him a pension just so that he could get by. So not only was he not good with money, and they sort of called him debauched, but that lent toward these commissions drying up because people didn't want a painting by Frans Hals any longer because of his problems. So the value of his paintings started to go down, the commissions started to dry up, and they even started to reattribute some of his paintings to other artists in the hopes of being able to sell them. That's how not hot he was at the end of his career. I think that was all I wanted to say about her, other than this is also on oak. This is also a plank, but it's only about 2/3 the size of the Piccanoy. And I believe they're on adjacent walls in the Dutch galleries. It's been a while since I've been up in that gallery, but you can definitely look at both of them and contrast them with one another. Christine, do we have any questions about Frans Hals or this portrait of a woman?
No, we actually don't. And let's take
Okay.
Go ahead and move on.
Okay. In the interest of time, I'll turn it back over to Ray.
Yeah. Dutch landscapes were extremely popular in the 17th century and remain popular today. They combine wonderful technique, faithful realism, and emotional elements. When well executed, Dutch landscape paintings reveal the beauty of nature, rousing emotion and inspiration of God's creation. Landscapes typically were thought of as representing God's infinite presence in nature. These paintings are in the DIA's collection, and all of them up. They're from the famous Van Ruysdael family. Indeed, one of the rooms in the Dutch gallery is dedicated to their paintings, particularly those of Jacob van Ruysdael. The painting to the left is Isaac van Ruysdael. In the center is his brother, Solomon, and to the right is Isaac's son, Jacob. Now, Isaac, and particularly Solomon, enjoyed success, and each taught and inspired Jacob. Jacob, however, was extremely successful during his lifetime and is currently considered to be the greatest 17th century Dutch landscape painter. Next slide, please. This is just a quick view of the river landscape done by Solomon. He was a very productive artist and a very influential artist, particularly on Jacob. You see a pleasing, idyllic scene of a river, one that is not necessarily accurate to a Pacific river, but one in which it gives a sense of beauty and pleasure. And you can see Solomon's impressive technical skills are demonstrated in the rendition of the water with its various reflections and the sky. The sky has exceptional tones and a sense of atmosphere. Next slide, please. This is the Jewish cemetery done by Jacob van Ruysdael from 1654 through 55. It's very big. It's over 4.5 feet tall and 7 feet wide. It's oil on canvas. As I mentioned, Ruysdael is considered one of the 17th century Dutch masters, and he inspired an entire generation of landscape artists. He is known to infuse images with unique sense of drama and profoundness, and this is considered, in the DIA's collection, the most significant one of his paintings, and it is currently on display and really dominates the room in which it's shown. Now, Dutch paintings at the time, such as this one, are filled with symbolism. For example, in this painting, there are elements that symbolize death and decay. For instance, you have those tombs in the foreground. These are 5 tombs from an actual cemetery that he sketched that was established by a Portuguese Jewish population 5 miles south of Amsterdam. Now, all the other images in the painting are from Rysdale's imagination. Those are the only actual things that he had seen. But he places all these objects together to create an allegory or an analogy of the impermanence or temporariness of life on Earth. Everything is temporary, everything is changing, cycles of destruction and renewal. You've got the stream in the foreground by the tombs, symbolizing the swift passage of time and the decay that the water erodes. You have that church in the background, which is in disrepair. It's crumbling ruins that are, so it symbolizes that even solid man-made structures cannot withstand the force of nature and time. Obviously, the dead trees to the right, obviously a symbol of decay, and you've got elements in this dramatic sky of dark and a threatening destruction. But Rysdale combines that with suggestions of hope and renewal. You also have clearing in the sky. You've got light clouds and blue skies that are trying to peek through, symbolizing optimism in the storm's end. And as we mentioned, light is extremely important in the Dutch culture at this time. It is considered as the symbolism of God's grace shining down on them. And then while you have decay on the right side, on the left side, you have a much more lush landscape. You've got blossoming shrubs and, renewed trees, white birds in the sky, symbol of hope, and of course, a rainbow, which is universally considered a symbol of hope because they typically appear after a storm. But all the symbolism aside, the details, the color, shapes invoke the sensation of beauty. When you stand in front of it, it is beautiful. There's a lot going on. It's very profound. It's spiritual. It's very emotional. It really is quite a painting. And I have to apologize because we still wanted to cover still lives, and we have some extraordinary ones at the DIA, but unfortunately we run out of time. Cindy, do you want to close this out today?
Sure. Thanks, Ray. So thank you for joining us today. I think that you could see from the images that we were talking about that during the 1600s, the Dutch experienced and caused extraordinary change. The Dutch Republic, which is today called the Netherlands, won its independence from foreign rulers. Dutch ships were speeding across the globe, bringing home beautiful trade goods and riches. The new colonies that the Dutch established. Sorry, folks.
You were supposed to be done now by now.
I know.
What's going on? Well, in any event.
So sorry. Anyway, Let me finish up with the closing.
Okay.
I have a new laptop, so I haven't been able to, shut down all of these noises yet. So the Dutch artists, they responded to those times. They turned their eyes out into their world, the land that surrounded them, the way people lived, the religious stories that guided them. I thought this was important to mention. They were very prolific. Some scholars estimate that they created up to 300,000 paintings during the Dutch Golden Age. The paintings were filled with minute and realistic detail, and they are like windows. They provide us with views into the Dutch world of the 1600s. I'd like to continue by telling everyone that the DIA is open. We invite you to plan your visit by reserving a timed entry ticket via the DIA website. Our hours are Wednesday through Friday, 9 to 4, Saturday and Sunday, 10 to 5. Our current exhibitions include Robert Blackburn and Modern American Printmaking, that goes through September 5th. Expression and Experience, which goes through October 3rd. And of course, Detroit Style, Car Design in the Motor City, which runs through November 15th. We have one off-site exhibition, Visions of American Life, that runs through September 11th, and that's at the Lorenzo Cultural Center in Macomb Community College. Next Thursday, please join us at 1 o'clock, August 19th, for Thursdays at the Museum. when we will present Through Her Eyes, Women Photographers. I'd like to say a quick thank you to our producers, Amanda Keeley, Chris Mark Curtis, and Kimmy Dobos-Wolf. Thank you for joining us today. We'll see you next week.